And welcome to the General Government Budget Committee. Today we're going to hear the budgets of the Attorney General and the State Treasurer. Then we'll also make our recommendations regarding the Human Rights Commission and the Office of Administrative Hearings. So only because Mr. Wu has a previous engagement, we're going to start off with the Attorney General's office. It's not because Derek is tall.
Not what I heard. Good afternoon, committee. For the record, my name is Stephen Wu, Senior Fiscal Analyst with Legislative Research. I'll be going over the Attorney General's budget. You should have a copy of it in front of you. As I'm sure everyone on this committee is aware right now, the Attorney General, Derek Schmidt, is with us in the audience. He'll be able to provide some comments on the agency's operations. I'll be giving some remarks on various budgetary changes from year to year. Similar to the presentation with Capers, I'll keep my remarks contained within the first couple of pages of this analysis. It'll give you a very high-level view of the agency's budget from year to year. If you want more detail, you can delve deeper into the document. There's some more details on specific programs or specific changes deeper on throughout. I'll give page references where it's relevant. So we'll start with fiscal year 22. You can find the summary of this on page 2, as well as line-by-line changes on page 6. For fiscal year 22, the agency requests about $31.3 million and about 177.4 FTE positions. This is about $3.9 million higher than what was approved by the 2021 legislature, and this is largely due to the distribution of opioid settlement monies. There's an increase of about $3.6 million. So if you'll recall, last year the legislature passed HB 2079, which enacted the Kansas Fights Addiction Act. That act directs the receipts of opioid settlement monies to two funds. First, 75% of these receipts goes to the Kansas Fights Addiction Fund. This fund is dedicated to provide grant funding for qualified applicants for projects and activities to help prevent, reduce, treat, and mitigate the effects of substance abuse. 25% of the remaining 25% of these receipts go to the municipality's Fight Addiction Fund. The purpose of this fund is sort of similar to the Kansas Fights Addiction Fund in that it helps provide funding for projects that combat the effects of substance abuse and addiction. It also provides some funding to municipalities to reimburse expenses related to previous substance abuse mitigation efforts or arising from certain activities that are covered within the Kansas Fights Addiction Act. Attorney General's office is primarily the vehicle for which this money just flows through. It'll be distributed out to applicants and local entities. The agency request also includes a supplemental request of $43,000 and about 2 FTE positions for some new auditors within the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General. So among its responsibilities, the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General is tasked with auditing the state Medicaid program. This increase in positions would allow the office to dramatically increase the number of audits it's able to conduct. It would also allow for the continuity of operations should an auditor position become, vacant or unavailable. In review, the agency is requesting $43,000 and 2 FTE for that in this year. There are also some changes. Some increases and decreases in 22 that I'm just going to gloss over. There's some decreases for some expenditures that the agency doesn't plan on making within the Office of the Inspector General. There's some decreases for fringe benefit adjustments as a result of the issuance of the Capers pension obligation bonds last year. There's some slight increases for grant funding received by the Medicaid Fraud and Abuse Division. And there's some slight increases for contractual services spends for litigation-related expenses in the concealed carry licensing unit. Now, for fiscal year 22, the governor concurs with the agency's request with one exception, and that's in regards to the supplemental request. The governor does not recommend the adoption of the supplemental for the 2 additional auditor positions. So the recommendation is about $43,000 lower than the agency's request. Now, at this point, I'd be happy to answer questions on 22.
Very good. Thank you, Stephen. I'm curious, you discussed continuity of service under the auditor positions. How many auditors are there currently? Do you have that handy, or should I reserve that for later?
I don't have that on hand. If the Attorney General doesn't have that either, I can follow up with you after.
Alrighty.
I'm hearing whispers of 2 behind me.
2, okay. Okay, so it's not like we're guaranteeing service with 100 people on staff, and it'll be better if we have 102. We're going from 2 to 4.
Correct, that you're doubling the positions.
Excellent, okay. Committee, questions regarding 2022? Yes, Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on the FTEs on 2022. Adding 2 and we're taking 2 off, is that what we're showing here?
No, so for 22, the agency's asking for 2 more. So those are those 2 auditor positions.
Right.
The governor is not recommending that for 22. So there's a decrease of.
So it's back to where it was, 175.
In the governor's recommendation, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. Share with me where I can find the litigation costs and the sums of those litigations. I'm trying to catch up with you. I see the criminal litigation, but I'm looking at, is it the civil litigation? You have civil litigation? Where is help me find the total amount of litigation costs for 2022.
Sure. The total amount isn't reflected in that document. Just talk about year-to-year changes in it. There's some details later on in, let's see, talk about some details in 23.
I'll read through it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can follow up with you afterwards
I
on
appreciate that. Thank
dollar
you.
totals.
All right, and one other question that popped up kind of because of that question. Under contractual services, I'm assuming from the past, that's outsourcing legal services, is that correct? Contracting attorneys?
Sure, that is one component of it.
One component, okay, all right, very good. Don't think we have any further questions, and Paul left the room, so at least for this year, you're getting off easy there.
What, I'll take it.
But
So
go ahead and pull up the 406, 410 right now, all right?
I think I have to leave now. So let's move on to 23. You'll see a summary of this on page 3, as well as line-by-line details on page 10. So for 23, the agency requests about 26.9 million and 177.4 FTE positions. This is about 4.4 million lower than what the agency requested last year in 22. And the most significant change in this is due to a decrease of about 3.4 million in distributions from opioid settlement monies. This is a similar item to in the previous year. The agency, at the time of submission for its budget, anticipated most of it coming in, a large chunk of it coming in 22. And so the absence of that in 23 causes a drop of about 3.4 million. Now, would be worth noting that if you look at the Attorney General's testimony for today, since they indicate that since submitting their budget, they have revised their estimates as litigation has developed and progressed, and they have accordingly estimated higher amounts for 22 and 23. I'll let the Attorney General go into more detail on that, but just wanted to call the committee's attention to that. Now, the request for 23 also includes an enhancement request, again, for those new auditor positions. The agency is requesting about $154,000 for these 2 new positions within the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General. This amount is a bit higher than in the previous year because at the time the budget passes, you wouldn't be funding a full year in 22, whereas you would be in 23. And 23 also contains a number of adjustments in the expenditures. They're mostly decreases, and a large part of those are due to expenditures made in 22 that don't occur in 23. So for example, payments for scrap metal dealers, that occurs, the final payments will occur in 22, they don't occur in 23, so you'll see a drop there. There are also some adjustments for litigation costs that happen in 22, not for 23, as well as for some distributions of federal grant monies. 23, the governor concurs with the agency's budget, so the numbers for the governor's recommendation side will be one and the same with the agency request. At this time, happy to answer questions on 23.
I'm trying to chew my way through here, the opioid settlement distributions. Representative Amix, while I get my head around my question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wood says that maybe I'm just missing something here. Under the governor's recommendation, it talks about including $6.3 million in STF. Summary, it has 6.7 in STF.
Let's see. That might be a typo on my part. The number should be 6.3. 6.7 for 22. 6.3 for.
Questions for Mr. Wood? Seeing none. All right. I think you cheated just a little bit.
Comment.
You paged Paul to get him out of the office.
You weren't supposed to find out about that.
Saw you on your phone, pretending like he was typing in numbers. All right. I'd like to welcome to committee now the Attorney General Derek Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, thanks for having us back. It's good to be back again. 12th time we've done this in some form, so thank you. The big picture for us, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the chance to address any questions the committee has. We support the governor's recommendation. It is largely what we recommended. There's one small difference, and that's fine. We don't. It's when, if you decide it's okay for us to start the two auditor positions, the difference between the governor and us is we recommended to go ahead and start it this fiscal year so we can start getting the application process going. And her recommendation was for us to start at July 1, and that's fine with us if that's, what the decision is. Largely, the budget is a current services budget across the board. Obviously, some services fluctuate every year because you don't know who's going to sue whom when, but it's largely a current services budget. There are two policy differences, one that's reflected here, and I wanted to touch it, and then the other that I wanted to bring to your attention. Mr. Wu said I would, and I will, where we would suggest you consider at least adjusting upwards a couple of the budgeted amounts for the opioid settlement expenditures because we've recovered more money that needs to flow out in grants by the statute than we thought we were going to have at the time we submitted the budget. So the two differences are, number one, the request for two auditors in the Medicaid Office of Inspector General, and the other is the opioids. On the Medicaid Inspector General piece, just the brief history of that office, I think, is helpful in understanding why the request. Some of you who've been around a while, I know Representative Burrows and I served together for a long while on this, will remember the creation of the Office of Medicaid Inspector General by statute many years ago, about 15 years ago. And it was sort of a nomadic position for a while. It originally went to the Health Policy Authority, and then it got moved over to KDH&E, and then it was attached specifically to the Medicaid division, and then it kind of it existed, but it didn't really have people for a while. And a few years back, you'll remember, Mr. Chairman, that members of the legislature approached us and asked if we'd be open to taking it on and making it work. And so, of course, we said yes, and you told us to do that, and we did. And we've been in the process of doing that. We selected what I thought was an excellent Medicaid Inspector General. We did a national search, ended up with one of our own. The Senate confirmed her. It's a Senate confirmable position, and we got up and running. And then it turned out she was so good that the Medicaid program stole her away, and Sarah Forty now runs the Medicaid program, so we had to start over in searching for a new Inspector General. We did that. Steve Anderson is in that position. He's been confirmed by the Senate. He's running the office. And all of that is by way of saying, I think we are finally, knock on wood, in a fairly stable position in the program. And one of my tasks to Steve, it's an independent office under our umbrella, is once you got your feet under you, tell me what you need to get this thing right-sized. And his request to me this year, which I agree with, and it's reflected in our budget request, the governor's recommended, is to add two auditor positions. There are currently 4 employees total in the Office of Medicaid Inspector General. There's the Inspector General, Mr. Anderson. There is one other person who's an auditor. They are the 2 auditors. Steve himself is an auditor, and there's another auditor. Then we have a number cruncher, a data analyst. And then there's a clerical person, right, administrative person. And that is the Office of Medicaid Inspector General. Steve's request is to add 2 auditors. He thinks that more accurately fits the scope of work. I agree with him, and that's why the request is here. I would add, as we originally, this may be down in the weeds more than you care, maybe not, because that the Medicaid Inspector General Office, we've had vacant positions because we had the change in IGs. We've had some accumulated cash balance in the fund. You all provide $400,000 a year. That's been standard since you sent it to us. And we haven't spent it all every year for those reasons. What you've done in the past is just reappropriated that so that the balance built up. That's not what's in the governor's budget this year. Instead, she lapsed the funding and then proposed to appropriate new funding in the new year. It's the same bottom line on the amount spent, but our request originally was we didn't want to ask for new money for the 2 new auditors. We had cash balance built up to pay for them for a couple of years. Eventually, they're going to cost money, but for the first couple of years. But for whatever reason, that's not how budget decided to structure it, and that's fine. It's the same bottom line, but that's why it looks like it's a new appropriation. It is, but it's actually paid for by the lapsing of the money that was already there. So that's the 2 auditors position. With respect to the opioids, Mr. Wu did a good job of refreshing everybody's memory on the history on that. This is the national litigation we've been part of very much against manufacturers, distributors, and others in the supply chain for opioids. The recoveries have begun. Last year, we got the first recovery that comes to the state of Kansas. The defendant was McKinsey and Associates. That netted out about $3.9 million that by statute under the Kansas Fights Addiction Act that you all enacted last year, we are to administer as grant programs. One goes directly to municipalities and they carve it up in a manner they've agreed among themselves. The other goes in a pot and there's a board that entities can apply for grants. That's why our budget went up $3.9 million this year, because that money, that $3.9 million is flowing through it. What's happened since then, of course, we had to submit the budget in August, September, we're developing it. What's happened since then, it's become clear that we're going to reach settlement with payout from 4 more defendants, the 3 large national distributors, as well as Johnson & Johnson. And I can't say, these things are like, you got to approve them multiple times and there are conditions subsequent. It's going to happen unless something truly comes off the rails. I think we will get the first payment from that settlement in this fiscal year. And then I think we will get the next payment, which is a larger amount next year, and then it'll continue in smaller amounts for a number of years. The bottom line in all of that is that based on that, we now expect for an additional $7.5 million to flow through the opioid settlement funds and go out in the form of grants under the statute this year. And then we expect an additional $34.3 million to flow through next year because of those settlements. So, just in the spirit of disclosure, those are no limit funds that we put the money in, but I expect the expenditures are going to be materially higher than what's in the budget because we've got the extra recoveries that'll go out in grants. And so I suggested to the Senate committee, and I'd suggest to you for your consideration, you might want to increase the budgeted caps on those so they more honestly reflect what we think is going to happen. And those numbers, if you wish to do it, are in my testimony. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to stand for questions.
Committee questions? Representative Burrows.
Thank you. Share with me the grant process. How will it be fair and equitable to communities that just want a grant, or will it be tied to those communities that have suffered the effects of opioid impact within their community? All of those. Will it be set up? Will that be some of the criteria that they'll have to provide evidence, or is it just going to be, okay, XYZ County submitted a sheet and said this is what it is, we'd like to have that grant?
Right. So, Representative, let me answer that question by telling you how the statute came to be, and if it turns out I'm not responsive, you'll tell me and I'll do it. But I think it'll be more helpful if I answer that question this way. So, this was what we talked about previously in this subcommittee, in this committee. This was unbelievably complex litigation, even from just a public litigant standpoint. Not only did we have every state, but we had a whole lot of subdivisions within states, but not all the subdivisions were the same. Some chose to retain their own outside counsel and bring their own lawsuits. Others literally right next door in some case with similar harm, similar effect, for policy reasons or otherwise, did not choose to retain their own counsel. They basically said, we'll wait to see what the AG's office does in recovery. And so, that creates issues on who's paying for the outside lawyers and who gets what. And to your point, what are the criteria for sending money back out? All of those types of issues were on the table last year when, not this committee, but this body, your colleagues negotiated and enacted the Kansas Fights Addiction Act. It was intended to be the resolution to those types of questions. And the KFAA sets up a distribution mechanism that includes what I might loosely call a formula for distribution. And essentially, this is what it does. It says when we collect money from this litigation, it goes into these two funds that we administer, the two that we're talking about here having more money. The Municipalities Fight Addiction Fund, and the Kansas Fights Addiction Fund. The decision to do that way was part of a bargain that was intended to balance the types of issues you're talking about. 25% of the money goes into the Municipalities Fund, 75% goes into the Kansas Fights Addiction Fund, and the expenditure decisions are different for the two funds. For the Municipalities Fund, that money gets expended, distributed to eligible municipalities, cities, and counties, essentially based on a negotiation between and among the cities and counties themselves. The statute requires that an MOU be negotiated and executed by the cities and counties. I have to sign off on it. I believe we've accomplished that, and I think that is done. We worked through the league and the association to get that and got it. And we will distribute that money pursuant to that. So that sort of addresses your question. I can't tell you here's who gets it, but I can say that the cities and counties, heavily affected, not heavily affected, spent a lot of money already, didn't spend. They were at the table negotiating with each other for how to distribute that 25% of the money. The other 75% of the money goes into the Kansas Fights Addiction Fund. By statute, there is a grant board that's set up. I get to appoint the chair, and then other officials appoint the other members. Governor has an appointment, the two leaders in both parties in both chambers of the four. I think the league has an appointee, the association. I think there's an addiction group. I'd have to double check all the appointing authorities. And the idea then is that any eligible entity, which is cities, counties, not-for-profits, service providers, anywhere in the state, can submit a grant application, and the board decides, who winds up getting the money. Because there were concerns during the negotiations about kind of what you're talking about, make sure that it doesn't all go here or there. There are, and I don't have them memorized, but there are in the statute certain limitations. So a certain amount of the total pot has to go to, I think it's actually by congressional district, if I remember right. But anyway, geographically distributed. There may be other factors. I can't remember. You get the idea. So we'll follow the statute is the bottom line.
So that we're coming into, I don't want to call it a windfall because it's money that needs to be reimbursed to local community as well as the state for the impact that opioids had on the healthcare of many people in the state. I was just wanting to ensure that this body understood that even though we are allowing the additional monies to come up, we want to also ensure that they're being distributed properly, because that money is not going to be there forever. That it's going to come in, it's going to go out, and the 75% to the state was what I was more interested in, as to how that was going to be controlled and spread across the state.
Yeah, and Representative, I might appreciate that, and I might just add a couple of other nuggets that maybe are helpful as you and the committee think about how this is going to work, because this is all new. This is the money hadn't been there before. In terms of the mechanics of handling this money, I mean, the board will make the decision on the grant, who gets it, who doesn't. But then the mechanics of handling it, the statute authorizes us, and we will be doing this, to contract with the Sunflower Foundation Healthcare for Kansas. They are a grant managing organization. That's what they do. And we thought that made a lot more sense than having us build capacity to administer and monitor grants. Instead, we just contract, because some years there'll be more money and some less, and so it's not going to be even. So we're well advanced in our discussions with Sunflower. We don't quite have a signed agreement with him yet, but I'm pretty confident that's going to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for being here today. Kind of a follow-up on the opioid addiction. You're saying it's going to jump to 34 million in fiscal year 2023. Do you have a sense, will this continue for 10 years, 20 years? I mean, what's sort of the trajectory for this?
Right. So the short answer is many years. I would say, you know, if I had to sort of hit an average, I'd say around 15, but don't hold me to a literal number. Here's why it's a little hard to predict. When I said this was complex litigation, you know, on both sides of the V, us versus them, I talked about how it's complex on our side, where we had to work out competing claims by the cities and the counties and the state and all that. We got that resolved. And by the way, one thing I didn't say, we haven't announced this yet. Not that, you know, people are waiting with bated breath, but I think we ought to be proud of our folks in Kansas. We have reached 100% agreement with all of our litigating cities and counties on how to resolve this. That's not true in every state. Some states, there are cities fighting the state over who gets the money. 100% agreement, everybody's on board. So it's been very good that way. That's our side of the V. The other side of the V, though, is the defendants, and this is going to go to your question. It's not like a spigot where we turn it on and the water flows evenly. I mean, we're suing different entities with different claims, and they get resolved on different timelines with different conditions. So the current batch of settlements is 4 entities. It's the 3 large drug distributing companies, Cardinal, AmerisourceBergen, and McKesson, plus Johnson & Johnson as a manufacturer. Why are they in with the 3? There's no logical reason. That's just the way the negotiations came together. So we're resolving those 4 sets of claims for ourselves, the other states, as well as thousands of cities and counties. The terms of that settlement, which is different from McKesson, the 3.9 million is already in the bank, and it'll be different from future settlements with other defendants we haven't resolved yet. The terms of that settlement provide for a payout over, I think it is 15 years. It's right at 15. I may be off by a year or 2, but it's not an even amount every year. So that's part of the reason you see, like, we expect 7.5 million this year and a quarter of a year, a little more. We expect 34 million next year, which is not 4 times 7.5. It won't be that much the third year, but it will continue on. So it's going to be uneven, but roughly that 15-year period.
Any baseline sort of estimate as to what the totality of it would be over 15 years? I mean, you're talking what?
Yeah. With respect to the settlement with 3 distributors and Johnson & Johnson only, so setting aside any others we may settle with and not counting McKesson, which we already settled with, or not McKesson, McKinsey that we already settled with. Because we got 100% participation from our cities and counties who were already suing, because that was a variable that determined how much would ultimately come in. Everybody's on board. I think the final number, I can get you a more precise number, but I believe it's going to be in the $190 million range total over that 15 years. Significant amount of money. Significant amount of money.
Also in your report, you talked about relating to the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. It says we have eliminated the enormous contingent liability approaching $1 billion that the state faced from past failures to diligently force our obligations under such. What we would have had a liability? I'm not quite tracking how that could be.
Sure. Yeah, those last bullets, I suppose, were gratuitous in my testimony. I figure it's my last time, so we're going to put a few brag points in there. So thanks for noticing that. Here's what the story is on that, and this is all history at this point. The train is back on the rails. So the MSA, the settlement of the states with the tobacco companies, the MSA occurred in 1998. It was brand new. Nobody really knew how it worked. There are lots of moving parts in that bargain. It was the most complicated multi-state litigation in history at that point. The opioid is actually more complicated, but it was a big deal. And there's lots of parts, but one of the basic bargains that's relevant to this question, the companies agreed to make these annual payments in perpetuity to offset, at least in theory, the cost the taxpayers were bearing for the health costs of the products, people smoking and using cigarettes and tobacco products. In exchange for that, one of the things that the states agreed to do was to accurately and fully account for the sale of certain tobacco products within their state, to diligently enforce our obligation to account for that. And the reason for that bargain way back in 1998 was, the companies were basically saying, look, we're going to settle with you, but we've got competitors who aren't going to settle with you. And because we're paying you, the states, all this money, it creates an unbalanced competition field for us and our competitors. So you states, and if you want the money, you got to take on the obligation to account for what our competitors are selling in your state so that we can then balance things out. That's kind of the big picture bargain. Easier said than done. That phrase, diligent enforcement, has been the subject of an unbelievable amount of litigation since 1998 and is ongoing today. Kansas, not unlike other states, in the early days of the MSA, I mean, now we look at it, we're accustomed to it, we know what it means, but in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, it was brand new to everybody. And everybody was figuring out how to make it work. And the bottom line is we can't account for the sales of tobacco in the state unless you have a close working relationship between the Department of Revenue and the Attorney General's office, because they each see part of the pie. And that didn't always happen back in those early days. It does now. And so here's what happened. I was as surprised as you were when I took office way back in January of 11, because I'd never heard about this contingent liability. The state every year has to disclose, because of the bonds we issue, we're required to disclose anything that may cost a lot of money, so the bond investors can see a contingent. For the AG's office part, we're always asked to review the disclosure of contingent liabilities in litigation. If we lose this lawsuit, it might cost a bunch of money. That could affect the state's finances, be relevant to the bond buyer. So we have to do that every year. And I was very surprised to learn the first time I was involved in this back in 2011, the state's biggest contingent liability was the school finance litigation back then. If we lost that case, it was a whole lot of money. We had to disclose that. Second biggest contingent liability was tobacco arbitration. I didn't even know we were in arbitration for tobacco when I applied for this job and I ran for it. And what had happened was that the companies, the tobacco companies that were part of the MSA, they had accused Kansas and lots of other states of failing for over a decade to diligently enforce, to account for all of these sales in Kansas. And therefore they were demanding, they wanted their money back, because the bargain was they'd pay us money every year. And part of what we'd do is account for these sales. They said, we didn't account for the sales, so give us our money back. The demand was for whatever that math turns out to be, more than a decade of MSA payments, and that's a lot of money. It was approaching $1 billion, 750 or 780 million or something. And so, we did a risk analysis, made an assessment of how likely we were to lose, and ultimately we wound up settling with those companies and extinguished all of that liability. We now have no retroactive liability. It's gone, wiped it off the books. And we also have worked with you all over the years to try to plug some of the gaps in process that had enabled that liability in the first place. So for example, you may recall, Representative, the legislature has now approved, we worked with the governor's office, new compacts with each of the 4 resident Native American tribes in Kansas. All of them sell tobacco products on the reservations. They're all sovereign entities. They had no legal duty to tell us who they were buying from and who they were selling to. But the tobacco companies that we'd settled with didn't care about that. They just cared that that product was being sold in Kansas and we weren't accounting for it. So we entered into negotiations with the tribes, reached agreements with them. You all approved them. They are now binding on us and on the tribes. And they report to us every year their sales so that we can show that we're diligently accounting for that. So that kind of example. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General, for being here. I was going to say Governor, but I'm sorry. Your staffing, all the state offices and agencies we're talking to are having staffing issues. How do you stand right now as far as vacancies in your 175 FTEs?
Yeah, we have several. Last I checked, I think we were down 8 attorneys. Is that right? And I don't know how many. About 17 total vacancies. We're out recruiting to fill what we need to fill. But
which division has the greatest issue right now? And staffing, any of them?
I don't know that it's a specific division. It's sort of spread. Okay, so assuming that's true, our logic division, which is it's the division that does legal research, does AG opinions, provides counsel to a bunch of boards and agencies. But it is pretty well spread around the office. I know I'm at least 1 attorney short in the criminal litigation division. Are we still one short in fall? Two in civil litigation, which is defense of the state when the state gets sued. I think we're still one shy in consumer, aren't we? Yeah, so.
So because of those vacancies, you do have extra salary funding available that you could put towards these two auditors that you would like to add? Is that kind of, I understood you saying that if you, for the time being, you could pay for those two if you had to,
Yeah, it's
without an increase.
it's not quite that. The concept is right, but it's not because of those vacancies. And the reason for that is the Office of Medicaid Inspector General is its own creature by statute within the AG's office, and it has its own fund. It's funded by a direct appropriation from the legislature, separate from the rest of our office.
One big pot of money you can, okay.
It's not one to the other, no. What I was trying to say, I may not have done it very clearly, you all have put money into that Inspector General fund every year. Within the little confines of that little unit, we haven't spent it all every year for the reasons I already described. And so what we were originally suggesting, we got a little bit built up in there. We could use that to get these other two positions going. However, it's the same difference. It costs the same either way. It's just, do you let us keep the money and spend it, or do you take the money from us and then give it back to us to spend it? Either way, it's the same effect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General, it's always good to see you.
Likewise, Representative.
Thank you. Question going back to your staffing and being a number short. These are probably specialty positions. What is the market like?
Tough. It's really tough all the way around. It's really tough. And that's not, I mean, I know you talk with folks all over the state, so do I, and it's not unique to us. It's not unique to state government. It's tough to hire right now in a lot of areas. Market's challenging. And especially kind of to your point in the more specialized areas, criminal prosecution, for example, I would love to add another criminal prosecutor in Garden City. I think that would be very efficient. It would be a good use of resources. We have the authority. We've got the space. We could do it. But finding the right person who is a seasoned criminal prosecutor, because we're not keeping them at the main office, they're kind of out there on their own. You got to have somebody that's got real experience, right? You can't just send somebody a year out of law school and go forth and do these homicides by yourself. And so I need a seasoned criminal prosecutor who is on the market, wants to work for what the state pays, and wants to live in Garden City or nearby. That's, you know, a relatively small Venn diagram. So we're still looking for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, with these vacancies that you have right now that you're trying to fill, are those cases building up, or are you using outside counsel now and paying them, or what's the situation with that?
So, Representative, the answer is it depends on which vacancy you look at. With respect to the outside counsel question, in our civil litigation division, for example, those are the state's defense attorneys. When the state or its employees get sued, they call us and we provide them a defense. We don't have a choice. We're legally obligated to provide the defense. We can't delay it. They choose when they sue us. We don't choose when we get sued. So we must provide that service at the time it's needed. In those cases, if we can't handle it in-house because we don't have capacity for whatever reason, we would have to go hire outside counsel for assistance, and we would. In other parts of the office, for example, criminal prosecution, we have more discretion in our caseload. Under Kansas law, for most criminal cases, there's some exceptions, but for most, we're not required to take them. The local county or district attorney is the gatekeeper. They ask us for help, and we say yes or no. We're not obliged to say yes or no. So we can a little bit control the flow of caseload to accommodate vacancies. We're still heavier. We have, last time I checked, do you remember the CLD caseload? I want to say it was pushing 90. Don't hold me to the literal number, but it's close. I think we're around 90 cases in our criminal litigation division now. That's above our optimal number, even when fully staffed, and I think we're a body down now. So that sounds like a lot of cases if you're from a smaller or mid-sized county. It doesn't sound like much if you're from one of the metros. But I always remind our friends, the DAs in the metros, remember, if every one of those cases is a major felony. We don't have smaller ones because of the nature of the work we do.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That actually brought up a point over the weekend. I was having a discussion. When we contract out for outside services for attorneys. Is there a cap on the hourly rate to those attorneys?
No, when we're talking about, really the only space we do that in, with a couple of exceptions, is in civil defense of the state. The couple of exceptions are, sometimes we come over here, there's a statute, we come over and ask for permission to hire outside counsel for an ad hoc purpose to go sue somebody or help us sue somebody. For example, one that's been in the news lately, we are in the process, actually just finished the process of hiring counsel to help us in the natural gas price surge litigation from last February. So in case we just didn't have the capacity, the expertise, once we got past the threshold, we had to go get it. And, that was we were in front of the legislature twice seeking proper authority under the statute, and we just kind of got that done. So set that aside, that's different and rare. Normally, and ad hoc, normally in civil defense cases where we need outside help because somebody sued us and we got to assign counsel because we can't do it for whatever reason. The way we have done that, we bid all of that. We bid normally about every other year, although that's not hard and fast, but typically we'll put out an RFP. Law firms and attorneys can respond to it. They respond with a bid rate. If this is what we're going to charge you for this type of, for a partner, this is what we're going to charge you for an associate, this is what we're going to charge you for a paralegal, that kind of thing. And then once that's done, we now have a list of firms that have bid for particular types of work at particular rates. When an individual case comes along, the state gets sued for something and we have to assign firms, we go to that list that's already bid, and then we negotiate the individual contract for that case, the individual agreement for that case. And normally, the amount is less than what they bid. It's never more. Sometimes we just got to take what they got. So, yeah.
Is that an hourly bid or?
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right, well, that leads to the next that leads me to my next question. I had someone who was doing an audit of legal charges that were applied. I think this was a bank, actually, that he was talking about. But is there any downward pressure as far as the hours billed? Or do we just let that run?
No, we don't just let it run. Our ordinary practice is when we've retained counsel for a particular case, we require regular reporting. I think it's normally monthly, isn't it? I think that's right. On, what they're doing, what the billing looks like, what the nature of the work is. And we keep them posted in advance. If they're going to do something that deviates from what we expect for the next month, we want to know about it before they do it. And they're good partners on that. We've had no problems with that.
Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report, as far as your budget report, brought up another thing to mind. You have a Medicaid fraud prosecution fund and unit. And so you guys are responsible for prosecuting all Medicaid fraud as far as both where the care was inadequate or inappropriate, I guess, and where the charges, the billing was inappropriate, both financial and both ways.
Yes.
Basically, okay. I guess my question is, I take it that the incoming revenue is just if you were awarded, as it says, awarded fees and prosecution expenses following successful prosecution. I'm back when Medicaid was a little more of a hot issue here in the legislature, had done some research on Medicaid fraud and the rate of Medicaid fraud in various states. And I guess I'm wondering, what is the totality as far as in actual, if you're just getting the fees, but what are the total claim amounts like for Medicaid fraud in Kansas? I mean, roughly, if you comment on that.
I'd have to look before I just start sharing numbers. We file an annual report every year that shows all of the activities of the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, which is the part of the office you're talking about. We can get that for you, or they're all available on our website under the annual reports section. I think August is normally when we file that, if I remember right. So we'll have a new one coming up in 6 months or so. And it varies by year. Sometimes we recover more, sometimes less. Just depends on the nature of where cases are in a given year. I might say, Representative, with respect to, we call it the MFUCU, which is an unfortunate acronym, but it's the trade, the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Every state is required, as a condition of participation in the federal Medicaid program, to either have and operate a Medicaid fraud control unit, a MFUCU, or to get a waiver from the federal government for not having it. There actually now are no states with waivers. North Dakota was the last one, and they just got rid of it and stood up a MFUCU 3 or 4 years ago, fairly recently. So all 50 states have a Medicaid fraud control unit. Most states like us place that unit in their Attorney General's office. There are a few exceptions, but we're in the mainstream on that. The federal government pays 3/4 of the cost of operating that unit. So 75 cents on the dollar is federal money. The other 25 cents the state has to pay. And the way we operate here, that revolving fund that you see, when we recover money, usually in one of the civil cases, we do both criminal and civil Medicaid fraud cases. But when we recover money, we put a share of it in there to pay that ongoing, it's like a revolving fund, pay the ongoing cost of operating the unit, and then give the rest of it back to the Medicaid program. That's normally how it works.
If it'd be possible to have, if your folks could email a copy of the annual report, I'd appreciate seeing it.
Absolutely, we will. And I should also say, Representative, while we're on the MFUCU issue, because it's a federally required and therefore federally regulated program, we have to follow the federal rules. And one of the federal rules is we can only use that asset, the MFUCU asset, to address Medicaid provider fraud. We cannot use those investigators, those prosecutors, those data analysts, those people to go after beneficiary fraud. So we only look at fraud committed by providers of services under the program.
And Representative Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Attorney General. This isn't a MOFU question. I do like that acronym, though. The question I have, as you know, today we just had the redistricting settled in the chamber, and the governor's veto was overridden. And I anticipate there being a lawsuit. Will you be defending that, your agency, defending that lawsuit? And I guess my next question will be, will that be you, yourself, your agency, or will it be an outside firm? And I don't need to know who. I was just curious how it's going to be handled.
Sure.
I think the body needs to know.
Representative, we have anticipated for some time, regardless of what the map looked like, somebody was going to be unhappy and file one or more lawsuits. And so we've been preparing for that. And I said today, right after the House voted to override and then filled up the motion to reconsider, so we figured it was final. I think I said publicly we're prepared to defend it. And I would have said the same thing, whatever map you passed. I anticipate we will handle the state's defense in-house. That is my expectation. Obviously, that could change if whoever the plaintiffs may be adopt a litigation strategy that I'm not anticipating. One footnote on that I might add from our experience 10 years ago, which was very different in the sense that there were no maps enacted 10 years ago. So it wasn't a matter of defending a map. It was a matter of petitioning a federal judicial panel, 3-judge panel, to draw maps. But nonetheless, sometimes these things tend to get a whole lot of different plaintiffs and a whole lot of different defendants. And if that happens, it is certainly foreseeable that, we could have conflicts of interest arise where we can't defend 2 or more of the named defendants. I don't know who they're going to name because I don't know who the plaintiffs are going to be yet, or otherwise. So we may have to hire counsel because of conflicts or capacity, but I'm not expecting it if it's a simple, straightforward, challenge to argue the legal issues that are presented by the maps.
Do you remember what the cost was the last time that this went to court?
Yeah, I'm going to double check, but I believe it was around $600,000 we paid out of the tort defense fund. Might have been $700,000 last time. I actually thought it was an outrageously high amount. I pontificate on that now, and I certainly would like to avoid that this time. The reason I think that it was so high last time was in the absence of the legislature enacting a map, everybody and their brother wanted to go down to the courthouse and file a lawsuit against somebody. There were tons of plaintiffs and tons of defendants, and those were all federal civil rights lawsuits, 1983 actions, which under federal law, when you're the losing party, you have to pay the winning party's plaintiff's attorney's fees. It's a fee-shifting provision. Well, all the outside counsel knew that. By definition, the state was going to be the losing party last time because we didn't do anything. There was no map. There was nothing to defend. And so they all went out looking for plaintiffs because, they wanted a piece of the pie. If you're a plaintiff, you're going to win, and then we got to pay for your attorney's fees. It was very frustrating to me. So I'm hopeful that because maps have actually been enacted, I recognize the difference of opinion, and we're in a different legal posture. I'm hoping we're going to win. And if we win, we don't wind up having to pay the other side's attorney's fees, and we can cut that off. But those are the types of risks that are going to be involved.
Made $1.75 off that. Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know 3 years ago, the Secretary of State was trying to move the election fraud to the Attorney General's office. Has that happened? I haven't been following it. Have you taken on that responsibility?
Yeah, so when you all enacted the statute a number of years ago before Secretary Schwab that provided concurrent criminal original jurisdiction to bring election fraud criminal cases to anyone, it was kind of a race to the courthouse statute. It could be the local prosecutor, it could be the Secretary of State, or it could be the AG. Any of us had the same authority. Whoever filed first, it was your case, and that was true case by case. At that time, the Secretary's office really wanted to do those cases, and they did, and that's all history. Secretary Schwab has not chosen to do those cases, and so from his early days in office, we have agreed to take those when they come from him or by referral for prosecution purposes. We don't investigate them. That would be local law enforcement, or maybe if it was not Secretary's office as the custodian of the records might have some investigative role. But we don't just go out, doing those cases. But if they show up at the state's doorstep, they're going to get sent to us as opposed to the locals handling them for prosecution purposes.
Yeah, it just seemed to me the Secretary of State would have most of the material that would be involved in that. So it makes sense they'd be involved at least initially. But as far as prosecution, of course, that I would think that would fall under you. So that has taken place basically as far as you're concerned.
Yeah. For the prosecution purposes, in the event a case came to the Secretary's office for prosecution, they would send it to us. Okay. And in the event it came to us, we would do it, either directly or otherwise. The reality is most of these, their first stop is local, and the locals still have jurisdiction. And if they keep it, it never gets to the Secretary or to us.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions? Seeing none. All right.
Thank
Very
you
good. Thanks
very
for
much.
being here.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right, committee, let's turn our attention to the Office of the State Treasurer. And I don't see who, just a minute, I don't have my agenda with me. So Shauna Wake? Oh, Shauna Wake is from the agency. All right, Mr. Lemunyan is back. Welcome back to committee.
Thank you, Dayton Lemunyan, Legislative Research, and today I'll be presenting the Office of the State Treasurer. As the chair said, I'm joined by Shauna Wake on WebEx, who will take any questions on behalf of the agency. So whenever you're ready, let's go to page 6, which is the current year. The document says State Treasurer at the top. For the current year, fiscal year 2022, the agency requests a revised estimate of $32.2 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $3.6 million, or 12.7%, above the fiscal year 2022 approved budget. If you look to number 2, the primary reason for this increase is an estimated increase in unclaimed property claims following the COVID-19 pandemic. And the agency estimate does include a decrease of a half FTE. This is due to the agency eliminating a 1/2 vacant FTE position that was created pursuant to the legislation that dealt with the extreme weather event last spring. And the governor does concur with the recommendation for fiscal year 2022. I'll stand for any questions on 22.
Actually, Mr. Lemunyan, if you could refresh my memory just a little bit about this part-time person, this cold weather person. What was the job? What were they brought in to do?
I might direct questions about the role of the individual to the agency.
Okay, that's fine.
But if you look to the bottom of page 6, there is a description of the FTE position. One and a half FTE positions were approved, and one of those was filled. So the extra half that remained vacant is being eliminated. But I would direct any questions on the actual function of that FTE to the agency.
Yeah, I think I need to. All right, committee, any further questions for the analyst? Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am looking at the trajectory for the State Treasurer's Office. I mean, the fiscal year 2020 actuals, as far as the subtotal, I mean, ignoring the claims, I mean, prior to the claims, this would be more, I think the operational budget was like 3.395. Then in 20, you jumped to 3.598, and you're going to 4.581. I mean, on a percentage basis, it's really going up so much. What is driving that? That seems, I don't know. I mean, on the breakdown notes, I see a lot of it. Fees, other services have jumped from 360,000 up to over $1 million in just 2 fiscal years. Is part of what's driving that. I mean, that's $700,000 of it, and then the rest of it seems to be salaries and wages. Is there are there new duties, or I don't know? Do they hire a bunch of people, or what's going on?
Chair, committee members, Representative Wagner, looking at the 406, 410 fees, other services, aka 52600. That's primarily banking fees, and part of that is a function of they receive a credit based on the market conditions, and due to conditions, they're receiving less of a credit. I will not hold myself out as a banker or anything close to that, so the agency might be able to give you more information on that change.
Yeah. Okay, I think I might know, just because they have the state balances in the bank, and as far as all the operational costs attribute to them. And so it's, I know, like for our business, when interest rates drop super low, you know, the bank gives us a lower credit on our account balance versus what we have. And so that can affect our banking costs. But I mean, still is your guy, is he on WebEx? We'll get to him. Okay. Okay. Well, okay. Okay. All right. Anyway, and if I could, the actual salaries and wages going from 2.19 million to 2.626, did we increase FTEs? I mean, again, that's a pretty strong percentage increase over 1 year, and I mean, it's a 20% increase, you know, 1 year.
So the fiscal year 2021 actuals is the amount actually spent. So it could be that there are vacant FTE positions, but again, she would probably be
Okay.
better able to address that difference.
All right, well, let's get us up to speed then on 2023, and then we can ask some of those probing questions.
All right, so we're moving on to page 9 now. For fiscal year 2023, the agency requests $32.5 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $320,661 above the fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. If you look to number 1, this is partially due to a continued increase in anticipated increase in unclaimed property claims as that recovers following the pandemic. If you look to number 2, there's also a group of adjustments that amount to $120,000, and those are primarily due to increases to group health insurance, as well as to an anticipated increase to kids grant matching funds. And for fiscal year 2023, the governor recommends expenditures of $45.5 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $13.0 million, or 28.6% above the request. And this is primarily due to the governor proposing an SGF transfer to occur on a quarterly basis to the proposed Star Bond Food Sales Tax Revenue Replacement Fund. And these funds will be used to hold Star Bond districts harmless from the elimination of the food sales tax. Now stand for any questions on fiscal year 23.
Representative Wagner.
Okay, now the Star Bond District food sales tax replacement. Okay, because of the proposed elimination of the food sales tax, that in Star Bonds, they were getting that sales tax revenue rebated to the district and so this is to fill in the gap. Am I understanding it right?
So the chair, members of the committee, so the Star Bonds districts, those bonds are repaid using sales tax revenue. And so for districts that would no longer have a portion of the food sales tax, this amount is to hold those districts harmless to cover that portion of the food sales tax that would be eliminated.
Interesting ramification. Thank you.
Everything we do gets reflected in a dollar sign somewhere. Representative Arnberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a question for, it's dealing with this. Why would this be in the, this budget compared to like Department of Revenue's budget?
I want to suggest where the money should be dealt with. This is where it was placed.
That's fine. I just didn't know if there was a specific reason of why it's in the treasurer's and not the revenues budget.
Is the treasurer in some way involved in the repayment of Star Bonds?
I'm not.
Okay, all right, that's
I'm not a Star Bonds expert, but again, the agency could probably clarify that for you.
absolutely. All right, Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So real quick, this is an increase that will continue every year, we assume, as long as the food sales tax is gone, is right?
The amount would
Increase every year, maybe
this,
more than 13 million?
$13 million is the amount for one full year.
Right.
To hold those districts harmless. So if it were to continue, it would be a similar amount year after year.
Okay. Just want to make that clear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but those districts pay out over time, right? They end up, we eliminate those over time, right? When those bonds are paid off?
As they're paid off over time, yes.
Okay.
This would contribute to that.
Never seen it happen, but in theory, it can. Exactly. Representative Wagner.
Just another ramification. So any new Star Bond district is going to have a very hard time because there won't be any sales tax on restaurant. Or is this, I guess the proposal is to remove restaurant sales tax. It's not just grocery stores. So is that just for grocery stores? I'm usually thinking Star Bonds are like entertainment districts or whatever. This is more of a restaurant issue, or this is from grocery stores in those districts?
So an example would be a grocery store, those types of food products and what you might use to prepare food.
But again, for new Star Bond projects, sort of everything would be up in the air as far as whether we would have to do something or they'd have a much lower revenue base to be trying to get their money from. So anyway, just it's sort of a policy ramification, just speculating.
All right, any further questions from the committee for the analyst? Seeing none. Thanks for your work, Mr. Lemunyan. All right, next I'd like to welcome to committee Shauna Wake from the State Treasurer's Office. I believe Shauna's on WebEx, is that right?
Yes. Yes, sir.
There you are.
Hi.
Well, I hear your voice anyway.
Oh, well, I'm not sure how to make my picture come up on your screen.
Don't worry, I can't figure it out either.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There you are. I see you now.
All right.
Welcome to committee.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here for questions.
All right, did you hear a couple of them being bounced around first off?
Yes, sir.
All right, would you care to weigh in on those, or we can start over? Either way.
Absolutely. So I'll just jump right in on the salaries and wages difference. I will say that our actuals before didn't account for the 1.5 position that was added in the last legislative session for our 2 new programs, that one of those halves were dropping. So that was, we used current resources to make those functions happen, with the understanding that our housing loan program also is not fully utilized. And so our person who was dedicated to that was able to shift into the city utility loan program and the new link deposit programs that were initiated. Those are kind of slowly getting off the ground. So we were able to do that with existing resources. The next question that I had on my list here was just the banking fees. One of the hard parts of our budget is that we have to kind of estimate what our earnings credit is going to be for the year when we're estimating what our banking fees are going to be. And as you know, over the last couple of years, those rates have been historically low and have resulted in much higher banking fees than in previous years. Also this year, we rebid that contract, and with that came a slightly higher annual banking fee. So that accounts for some of that. And I understand that this star bond issue is a governor recommendation, and so it's not something that we were deeply involved in, but I do want to speak a little bit to that. Currently, the state treasurer's office distributes those funds from Department of Revenue to the star bond district so that they can make those payments, and that's our involvement in that process. And the way that I understand it, not an attorney, so don't get into that a whole lot, but that it's only that this 13 million is only applicable to the current or the ones that will be in place before a specific date. So that number I would expect to drop off over time as those bonds pay out. I think I got all the questions that was on my list. If there's anything else, I'm happy to answer those.
Yes, so let's go to some of the committee members. Representative Burrows, you have a...
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification in reference to star bonds. If I remember correctly, the funds that were just set aside for those star bonds projects that had grocery stores in them presently, and the loss of sales tax revenue that would have that would be lost to pay off those bonds, those dollars have been set aside by the governor at a ceiling of 13 million, I believe.
That I could not speak to, sir. I know that revenue went into the different businesses within those districts to find out who would be impacted and did an analysis of those. I would strongly recommend you reach out to revenue for that research.
Thank you. But usually those retail sales tax go to the Department of Revenue for dispersion.
Yes, sir. So revenue collects those, and then they give that money to us, and then we disperse that to the districts.
This is a special fund that was set up by the governor for those star bonds projects that had a grocery store presently in those star bond projects. Only moving forward, they will not be included. Any new star bonds project has a grocery store slated for it. My understanding, those sales tax revenues will not be included within the monies that the treasurer has set aside.
I believe that there is a date set in the bill or in the language here. So any star bonds that are off the ground as of that date, that is correct, are not included in that dollar amount.
Thank you. You stated it much clearer than I did. I appreciate that. Thank you.
If I could jump in with a question. Your explanation of the increase in salaries and wages did not exactly make sense to me, given that fiscal year 2021 was 2.19 million and fiscal year 2022 was 2.626. It seemed like you were referencing there was maybe a position and a half that might have changed. Am I mean, that would have been maybe $100,000 worth of the difference. How again do you get a $400,000 difference out of your salaries and wages? I'm just not following the explanation.
Sure. So the actual dollar amount of our wages spent in fiscal year 21 was less than what we had anticipated. During some of that time, we were going through transitions from one treasurer to the other. We had some vacancies to be filled during that time. We also had a period of time where we had people leave staff mid-year pending the results of the election. And so there were some vacancies throughout the year there. We also receive funds from an MOU that kind of decreased that amount just a little bit as well with Department of Administration for IT costs.
Okay, so your FTEs didn't change, but your actual number of employees went up because you filled a number of vacancies, and that's the main driver?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
I can try, understand, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. I do have a question regarding it. I see the numbers and I understand the numbers regarding the unclaimed properties. Can you kind of tell me a story about how this develops? During COVID, there are fewer claims. After COVID, there are more claims. How is this? What's the mechanics behind this?
So we generally see a pretty strong correlation between the amount of claims paid and the amount of outreach performed in this program. In fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 20, there wasn't as much outreach because we didn't have the ability to go out and shake hands with as much people. Clearly, under the new administration, Treasurer Rogers is very dedicated to getting our word out, and so he's been focused on doing that, and we anticipate an increase in our numbers because of that.
Okay, that makes sense. It was outreach that I was missing out on in that picture. Okay, that does make sense. All right, further questions? Representative Wagner.
I do want to ask on the bank fee question. So literally, you guys run all the checks for the entire state government? Do other agencies have bank fees, or it's just all of it is in your department is where it's paid out? Is that correct?
Well, we do, all of the state treasury money goes through our office. There are agencies who have fee funds, so they would have banking fees associated with their smaller fee funds. That money is netted into the state treasury on a weekly basis, or when their balances reach $1,000 or whatever the PMIB has set up for them. Generally speaking, all of the bank fees come through our office. We do have a few other agencies who scan checks, but they scan checks into the account and we pay for those fees for them to do so.
Okay. Thank you. That helps a lot.
Sure.
Right, that did remind me of the question that I had percolating regarding the STAR bonds. Why was that $13 million included in your budget rather than in revenue where normally tax receipts would show up?
I wouldn't try to get into the reasoning for anyone else's actions. I would assume it's because the money comes out of our fund and to the districts, and it's a transfer from revenue to our office before it goes out.
All right, that does answer the question. I didn't realize that Treasury touched that at all.
Yes.
All right, very good. For the questions. Representative Arnberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to state that she did answer that earlier when you were out of the room. So if you were in here, you would have known the answer to that question.
I apologize for napping. And thank you for re-explaining it for those of us who missed it.
Not a problem.
And, well, we won't be dealing with Representative Arnberger anymore. All right, I think that it rounds out the questions then. Thank you very much for being here. Sort of being here. All right, committee. We're doing okay-ish. Let's turn our attention. We'll put on our other hats and look at the Kansas Human Rights Commission budget that was presented to us yesterday.
Mr. Chairman, I make the motion that we accept the governor's recommendation for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023.
By Representative Amix. See any. Hasn't. Anyone have any comments they'd like to make regarding this budget?
Thing that we really talked something about.
That's right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that was administrative hearings. Right, I remember that conversation though. Yeah. Moved and seconded. There seems to be no discussion. So all those in favor of passing out the Human Rights Commission budget for 22 and 23 per the governor's recommendations, say aye. Opposed, say no. Very good. That will be the report to appropriations. Let's look at the Office of Administrative Hearings. I have a suspicion that Mr. Amix has some comment. Representative Amix has some comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry. No, the only question that we had yesterday when we were talking about was, I think it was $96,000, $26,000 to the staff, and $70,000. Right. And I think the explanation was very good on that, so thank you.
And I agree that the explanation was good. This is a slightly different animal than we were dealing with when we dealt with the Ethics Commission, because it was this committee that recommended recommending their budget salary increase to the governor and progressing through this route. We weren't anticipating the governor making a 5% universal statement. I don't know how they're going to choose to handle this in appropriations, but myself, due to the fact that this committee did make that recommendation last year, I'm comfortable going to bat for the salary increase in the budget recommendation. So in that regard, we would be concurring with the governor's budget recommendation. Yes, Representative Arnberger.
Can I make the motion to start the process?
Do you have somewhere to be?
I do.
All right, yes, I would certainly entertain that motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that we pass out the Office of Administrative Hearings budget for fiscal year 2022, 2023 as the governor recommended.
Do I have a second? Second by Representative Amix. Discussion. Yes, Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are we going to include the salary increases on all the budgets that we're looking at? Or just this one? We've got to be consistent, I think.
I agree. And that's why I prefaced it by saying this is a slightly different animal because this was the recommended route that this committee made. How that's going to turn out in appropriations, I can't answer. But because we made that recommendation last year, I feel comfortable going to bat for this agency on this salary increase for this budget.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Discussion. All right, seeing none. All those in favor of passing out the Office of Administrative Hearings budget 22 and 23 per the governor's recommendations, say aye. Opposed, say no. Very good. Our work is, that will be the report to appropriations. And if you want to see someone tap dance, that's going to be the one to watch. All right. Not sure how that's going to work. We'll find out. All right, tomorrow, committee. What day is tomorrow? Thursday? Tomorrow we will have We will hear the budgets for the Secretary of State and for the Office of the Governor. And we will, provided we've had time to chew on these effectively, we'll make our recommendations for the State Treasurer and the Attorney General. Until that time, Tori, be on your way. We are adjourned.